What would you do if you had nothing left but the clothes on your back, an old horse, and a single $10 coin? What if the only thing that $10 could buy was a place everyone else had thrown away? A pile of rotting wood and broken stone that the world called cursed. For 19-year-old Mary Coulter, this wasn't a question. It was the only choice she had. She spent her last $10 on an abandoned fur trading fort outside Laramie, a place of ghosts and warnings that nobody had dared touch in 50 years. But the truth waiting for her under the cold, hard ground was a secret that would not only save her life, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in and stay close as we tell the story of the girl who bought a ruin and found a kingdom. Mary Coulter arrived at the edge of the Wyoming Territory looking like a ghost herself. She was thin and worn, her father's canvas coat hanging loose on her narrow frame. The dust of 3 states settled into its seams. Her face, framed by sun-bleached hair tied back with a leather thong, was stoic, but her eyes held the deep, quiet ache of someone who had lost everything. The Coulter Ranch, the only home she had ever known, was gone, swallowed by debt and drought after the fever took her parents in the spring. All she had left was Silas, her father's aging gray gelding, a bedroll, a cast-iron skillet, and the heavy, silver dollar-sized $10 coin her mother had pressed into her hand years ago, whispering, "For a true emergency." The emergency had come and gone, leaving only this last, cold piece of her past. She had ridden until the money ran out, until the kindness of strangers wore thin, until she found herself walking into the dusty mercantile in Laramie with the sole purpose of buying enough oats for Silas to make it one more day. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee, cured tobacco, and dry goods. 2 men were leaning against the counter, their voices low and gravelly. "Another season and it'll be flat to the ground," one of them said, spitting a brown stream of juice into a nearby spittoon. "Good riddance. Cursed ground, that place." The other man, the shopkeeper, nodded as he wiped down the counter. "Town's owned it for back taxes since before the war. $10 is what's owed. Might as well be $1 million. Nobody's fool enough to pay 10 cents for Blackwood's folly." Mary stood by a barrel of flour, her hand frozen on its way to her pocket. Cursed ground. $10. The exact amount she had. She listened as they spoke of the old Blackwood trading fort, a place abandoned in a hurry half a century ago after some unspoken violence. They said the winters there were colder, the wind keener, and that no man who tried to reclaim it had ever stayed past the first snow. The men laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. But Mary wasn't listening to their laughter. She was listening to the echo of her mother's voice, to the cold weight of the coin in her pocket. For the first time in months, she felt not the pull of the past, but the faintest whisper of a future. A future made of cursed ground and splinters, perhaps, but one she could own. She left the mercantile without the oats, the men's laughter following her out into the relentless sun. Her decision was made. $10 was everything she had. She would spend it on the only thing in the world that asked for nothing more. Mary walked to the town clerk's office, a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale paper and beeswax. The clerk, a man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger, his expression souring as he took in her dusty appearance. "What is it?" he asked, his tone implying she was wasting his valuable time. "I heard," Mary began, her voice quiet but steady, "that the old Blackwood fort is for sale, for the price of the back taxes." The clerk blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. He pushed his visor up on his forehead. "You mean Blackwood's folly?" Girl, that place is nothing but a woodpile waiting for a lightning strike. The deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on. Mary didn't flinch. She simply reached into her pocket and placed the heavy $10 coin on the worn wooden counter. The sound it made was definitive, solid. The clerk stared at the coin, then back at her face. He saw no doubt, only a flat, unyielding resolve. He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips as if he were party to a grand joke. "Your money," he said, scooping up the coin. He pulled a dusty yellow deed from a drawer, scrawled a few lines, stamped it with a heavy seal, and pushed it across the counter. "It's yours. All 160 acres of rocks, wind, and ghosts. Good luck to you." She took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her coat. As she walked out, she could hear the clerk already telling the story to the man who'd just entered, his voice full of amusement. She had just become the fool of Laramie. She had just bought a home. What was she thinking? A young girl alone, buying a place legends were built on, and not the good kind. Was it desperation, or did some deeper instinct guide her hand? What secret was sleeping inside those crumbling walls, waiting for someone with nothing left to lose? Let us know in the comments what you would have done with your last $10. And be sure to subscribe, because Mary's journey into the heart of Blackwood's Folly was just beginning. As Mary stepped out of the clerk's office and into the harsh afternoon light, a booming laugh cut through the street noise. "Well, I'll be. Is that the deed to the old Blackwood place?" The voice belonged to a man named Barlow, a rancher whose land bordered the abandoned fort. He was a big man, florid and loud, his wealth evident in his tailored coat and the silver conchos on his saddle. He'd been a rival of her father's, always looking to expand, always sneering at their smaller, hard-scrabble operation. He dismounted, walking toward her with a swagger. "Heard you bought it. $10 for a lifetime supply of splinters and nightmares." He looked her up and down, a cruel smirk on his face. "What's the matter, Coulter? Finally run out of options? I'll give you 20 for it right now, double your money. I could use the firewood." Mary simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, which seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. "Fine," he spat. "Go on up to your castle. We'll start calling you Fort Mary." He laughed again, turning to the men loafing outside the saloon. "Hear that, boys? We got ourselves some new royalty." The men chuckled along with him. Mary turned her back on their mockery and walked toward the livery to fetch Silas, the deed a small, warm square against her chest. Her path out of town took her past the mission church. Sitting on a simple wooden bench in the shade of a cottonwood was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a stillness that seemed ancient. She was Arapaho, her dress a mix of traditional beadwork and worn calico. As Mary passed, the woman spoke, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. "The ground remembers what the walls forget," she said, not looking at Mary, but out toward the distant, hazy mountains where the fort lay. "Listen to the cold." Mary stopped, turning to face her. The woman's eyes met hers for a brief, intense moment. There was no pity in her gaze, only a strange, solemn weight. Mary nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a gift she didn't understand, and then continued on her way. The words settled inside her, cryptic and heavy, another secret to add to the one she now owned. She needed to get her few possessions to the fort, and there was only one person she could ask. Jedediah Stone was a freighter, a man whose face was as weathered as old leather, and he had been her father's closest friend. She found him loading his wagon near the rail yard. He saw her approach, and his expression softened with a sorrow he didn't voice. She explained her purchase simply, without shame or justification. He didn't laugh. He didn't question her sanity. He just looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll haul your things," he said. "Be ready at dawn." The next morning, Jed's wagon rumbled to a stop, where a faint, overgrown track veered off the main road. This was the path to Blackwood's Folly. He helped her unload her bedroll, her father's toolbox, and the few other meager items she possessed. He pressed a small sack into her hands. "Some salt pork and coffee," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "A man's got to eat." He looked up the track, then back at her, his concern a palpable thing. "You're sure about this, Mary?" She just nodded. "It's mine, Jed." He sighed, climbing back onto his wagon. "You watch yourself out here. That place, it has a history." With a final, worried glance, he cracked his whip and the wagon lumbered away, leaving Mary alone with Silas, her belongings, and the silent, waiting wilderness. The road ahead was barely visible, swallowed by sagebrush and thyme. The walk to the fort was longer than she expected, nearly 2 miles over rising, rocky ground. The air grew thinner, and a persistent wind began to whisper through the sparse pines, carrying a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the autumn afternoon. Silas walked beside her, his head low, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. The land was starkly beautiful, a sweep of gray-green sage and pale, sun-bleached rock under an immense blue sky. But it felt watchful, indifferent. As she rounded a final bend, she saw it. Blackwood's Folly. The clerk hadn't been lying. It was a ruin. The high palisade walls that once enclosed the compound were mostly gone, reduced to jagged stumps of rotting timber. The main building, a long, 2-story log structure, sagged in the middle, its roof a gaping maw open to the sky on one end. Several smaller outbuildings were little more than heaps of collapsed logs. It looked as though a giant had stepped on it and moved on. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. Barlow's laughter echoed in her ears. Had she traded her last dollar for a grave? The wind picked up, moaning through the broken timbers, and Silas shied, his breath puffing out in a nervous cloud. She would not be defeated before she even began. She decided against trying to sleep in the main building. It felt too broken, too exposed. Instead, she found a small, detached structure that might have been a smithy or a stable. One wall had crumbled, but the other 3 and most of the roof were intact. It offered shelter from the wind. She led Silas inside, his hooves echoing on the packed earth floor. Using a piece of canvas from her pack, she covered the collapsed opening as best she could. She gathered dry wood from the fallen palisade fence and built a small, careful fire just outside the doorway. As dusk bled across the sky, turning the clouds to shades of violet and rose, she sat on an old stump, sipping hot, bitter coffee from a tin cup. The loneliness was a physical presence, as real as the horse beside her and the crackling flames before her. She had bought a pile of splinters and ghosts, just as they'd said. She wrapped herself in her bedroll, leaning against Silas for warmth, and listened to the fort settle around her. The wind was a constant voice, crying and whispering through the ruins. Exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her into a shallow, uneasy sleep. Sometime in the deep, moonless dark, a sound woke her. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, resonant thrumming, a vibration that seemed to come not through the air, but up from the very ground beneath her. It was deep and steady, like a slow heartbeat in the earth, emanating from the direction of the main house. Silas was awake too, his head up, ears pricked, a low tremble running through his body. The sound lasted only a moment, then faded into silence. The next morning, under a pale and watery sun, Mary forced herself to enter the main trading post. The interior was a disaster of decay. Dirt, leaves, and the debris of half a century lay thick on the floor. Pack rat nests were piled in the corners, and the faint, dusty smell of abandonment hung in the air. Sunlight streamed through the collapsed section of the roof, illuminating a chaotic jumble of broken furniture and rotted timbers. Her heart sank further. This would take more than hard work. It might take a miracle. She started in the one part of the large room that was still protected by a solid roof, what must have been the factor's office and main trading area. A long, heavy counter, scarred and pitted, still stood against one wall. She picked up a splintered broom she'd found in the smithy and began the monumental task of sweeping, of imposing some small order on the chaos. As she cleared away the thickest layers of dust and grime, she began to notice the floor. It was made of thick, hand-hewn planks, wide and solid. But as she worked her way toward the center of the room, she saw an anomaly. A large, rectangular section of the floor, perhaps 10 feet by 6, was different. The planks were a darker wood, possibly cedar, and they were fitted together with a carpenter's precision, the seams almost invisible. Unlike the surrounding floor, which was face-nailed with crude iron spikes, these boards showed no hardware at all. She knelt, running a calloused hand over the strange section. The wood was smooth, almost polished by time, but what struck her was the temperature. It was cold, not just cool, but a deep, penetrating cold, like cellar stone, a chill that seemed to emanate from deep below. The memory of the Arapaho woman's words surfaced with startling clarity. Listen to the cold. This was it. This had to be what she meant. She pressed her ear to the planks, but heard only silence. Silas, whom she had tethered just outside the main door, let out a low, uneasy whinny, pulling at his rope. He stared at the spot where she knelt. His nostrils flared. His animal sense felt the same wrongness she did. She went back to sweeping, her eyes scanning every inch of the cold wood. And then she saw it. On the edge of a single plank, almost hidden in the grain, was a small, carved mark. It was no bigger than her thumb, a beautifully rendered, stylized beaver, its tail arched. It wasn't a random doodle. It was a sign, a key. She traced its outline with her finger, a shiver running up her arm that had nothing to do with the chill of the wood. Someone had sealed this floor for a reason. Mary knew she couldn't tackle the mystery of the floor right away. Survival came first. The days shortened, and the cold and the wind grew a sharper edge. Before she could explore secrets, she had to have a roof over her head that didn't leak, and walls that could stand up to a Wyoming winter. She began to work with a quiet, relentless fury. Her father had taught her how to use tools, how to read the grain of wood, how to build things that last. She salvaged the best logs from the collapsed sections of the fort, her axe ringing out in the silent valley from dawn until dusk. She started with the small smithy, rebuilding the crumbled wall stone by stone, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and dry grass until it was airtight. She mended the roof, nailing down salvaged planks with old square nails she'd painstakingly straightened. It became her cabin, a single, snug room for herself and a sturdy stall for Silas. Every swing of the hammer, every log she lifted, was an act of defiance against the town's mockery, against her own despair. The labor was grueling, but it was honest. It scoured her mind of grief, leaving only the satisfying ache of tired muscles and the tangible proof of her progress. Silas was her constant, silent companion. He stood patiently for hours, his presence a warm, living anchor in the vast loneliness. While she worked, the fort slowly gave up more of its secrets. Tucked away on a high shelf in the office, she found a leather-bound ledger. Most of its pages were a fused, water-damaged brick of paper, but a few in the middle were miraculously preserved. The handwriting was elegant, precise French. She could only make out a few words, but the numbers and inventories were clear. Lists of pelts: castor, loutre, renard argenté, beaver, otter, silver fox. The quantities were staggering. On the last legible page was a name, written with a flourish: Jean Dubois, facteur. And next to his name, a small, perfect ink drawing of the same stylized beaver she had found carved into the floor. The cold patch in the main room was a constant, silent question. Every evening she would go and stand on it, feeling that unnatural chill seep through the soles of her worn boots. The place held a memory of cold. Finally, after a month of back-breaking labor, her small cabin was secure. A stack of firewood stood shoulder-high against the wall. She had a home. Now she could listen to the cold. She took her father's tools, a heavy claw hammer and a long steel pry bar, and walked into the main building. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. She knelt beside the beaver carving and found the finest of seams. She wedged the tip of the pry bar into it and put her weight against the end. The old wood groaned in protest, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the handle of the tool and up into her bones. But it didn't move. It was sealed as tight as a tomb. Mary repositioned the pry bar, finding a new point of leverage. She threw her entire body into it, her muscles screaming with the effort. There was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, and the end of the plank lifted a fraction of an inch. A puff of air escaped from the opening, and with it, an extraordinary scent. It was the smell of a deep, cold cellar, of ancient stone, but also of cedar wood, rich leather, and something else. A clean, faintly wild, musky aroma. It was the smell of well-cured fur. Heart pounding, she worked the pry bar down the length of the board, breaking the hidden seal. With a final, groaning complaint, the plank came free. She set it aside and peered into the darkness below. A set of steep stone steps led down into blackness. Lighting her kerosene lantern, she held it over the opening. The flickering light fell upon a small, stone-lined chamber, a vault carved from the very rock beneath the fort. It was not empty. It was filled, stacked to the ceiling with neat, canvas-wrapped bales, all of them tied with leather cord and marked with a stenciled beaver. The last shipment, the one that never left. It had been waiting here, in the cold and the dark, for 50 years. She descended the steps, the lantern light dancing across the walls. The air was frigid, preserving everything in a state of suspended time. She ran her hand over one of the bales. The canvas was dry and brittle but intact. With trembling fingers, she untied the cord on the nearest one and peeled back a corner of the wrapping. The fur beneath was breathtaking. It was a beaver pelt, but unlike any she had ever seen. The guard hairs shone with a deep, liquid luster, the undercoat thick and soft as velvet. It was a prime winter pelt, perfectly preserved. She opened another bale and another, silver fox, its fur like spun moonlight, ermine white as fresh snow, marten, otter, fisher. It was a treasure trove, a fortune in fur that defied imagination. Tucked into a small, carved niche in the back wall of the vault, her light fell upon something else, a heavy, iron-strapped strongbox. It wasn't large, but it was dense and formidable. There was no keyhole. Instead, its lid was adorned with a series of numbered brass dials. On the lid, an inscription had been carefully engraved in the same elegant script as the ledger. Pour ma fille, Cécile. For my daughter, Cécile. Lying beside the box was a small packet wrapped in oilskin. She carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a letter, the paper miraculously preserved. My dearest Cécile, it began. It was from Jean Dubois. He wrote of sudden violence, of an attack on the fort that had forced them to flee. He had hidden the Hudson's Bay Company's furs and his own life savings, intending to return for them as soon as it was safe. He never did. The letter gave the combination to the strongbox, a sequence of numbers based on her birthday. He wrote of his love for her, his hope for their future. With shaking hands, Mary turned the dials. The tumblers clicked into place. She lifted the heavy lid. It was filled with gold coins, a small fortune in itself. But beneath the gold were more personal treasures. A miniature portrait of a dark-eyed little girl, a silver locket, and a small bundle of child's drawings of birds and horses. This wasn't just a cache of wealth. It was a father's desperate, final act of love. As Mary stood in the silent, frozen vault, a howl of wind from the world above reminded her she was not safe yet. An early, violent snow had begun to fall. The storm hit with a fury that seemed personal, a physical assault of wind and blinding snow. The sky, the land, everything vanished into a churning vortex of white. Mary scrambled to get the heavy plank back over the vault opening, then rushed to bring Silas from his stall into the relative shelter of the main building. The blizzard was a test of every repair she had made, every nail she had driven. The wind shrieked through the old logs, and snow driven like sand scoured the walls. She huddled by the small stone fireplace in the factor's office, feeding it precious wood, the warmth barely pushing back the invasive cold. The discovery beneath her feet felt unreal, a dream from another life. The weight of it was immense. This wasn't a windfall to be squandered. It was a trust. Jean Dubois had left his legacy in her care, and she felt a profound, unspoken duty to him and to the memory of his lost daughter. For 2 days, the storm raged. On the second afternoon, over the ceaseless howl of the wind, she heard a new sound, a faint, desperate cry. She pulled on her heavy coat and fought her way to the door. Through the maelstrom, she could just make out a dark shape, a broken-down wagon half buried in a snowdrift on the old track. A man was stumbling toward the fort, carrying a small, bundled figure. He collapsed a few yards from her door. Mary dragged him inside, the snow and wind blasting into the room. He was Thomas, a homesteader, and the bundle in his arms was his son, a boy of about 7, pale and shivering with fever. Their wagon had lost a wheel just as the storm hit. They had been stranded for a day, their fire gone out. Without a second's hesitation, Mary went to work. She settled them by the fire, wrapping the boy in her own bedroll and every spare blanket she could find. She brewed hot, sweet coffee for the father and a weak broth for the child. She sacrificed her carefully rationed supplies without a thought. For the next day and night, she was no longer just a survivor. She was a protector. The fort, which had been her solitary refuge, transformed into a sanctuary for others. As she tended to the sick boy, bathing his forehead with a damp cloth, she thought of the little girl in the portrait, Cécile. This act of care felt like a promise she was keeping to that long-dead family. She was choosing not just to live, but to create a place of life and shelter. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the world outside was a silent, glittering expanse of white. Thomas, weak but immensely grateful, looked at Mary with awe. He looked around the clean, repaired room, at the sturdy walls that had saved them. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Mary looked at the sleeping boy, then out the door at the peaceful, snow-covered valley. The fort was no longer a ruin in her eyes. When Thomas and his son were strong enough to travel, Mary helped them rig a sledge to carry their essential belongings back to Laramie. The story they told upon their arrival sent a ripple of astonishment through the town. They spoke of the cursed fort that had been a warm, safe haven. They spoke not of treasure, but of the quiet, capable young woman who had saved their lives with nothing but her own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to fail. The name Fort Mary, once a term of ridicule from Barlow, began to be repeated with a different inflection, one of grudging respect. The mockery started to curdle into curiosity. Mary knew she couldn't sit on her discovery forever. She needed to know its true worth. She carefully selected a few representative pelts, wrapped them in canvas, and loaded them onto Silas. The ride to Laramie was different this time. People didn't laugh. They stared. They whispered. She ignored them, her purpose clear. She didn't go to the General Mercantile. On Jed's advice, she sought out a man named Mr. Abernathy, a professional fur buyer from Cheyenne who was known for his expertise and his integrity. He was a small, neat man with wire-rimmed spectacles and gentle hands. He met her in a quiet room behind the land office. He unrolled the pelts on a large table, his expression shifting from professional interest to profound reverence. He ran his fingers through the fur, examining the leather, the color, the density. He was silent for a long time. "In 30 years, he said finally, his voice hushed, "I have never seen quality like this. The preservation, it's a miracle." He named a figure for the single silver fox pelt that made Mary's breath catch in her throat. The entire collection, he estimated, was worth more than most of the ranches in the valley combined. As it happened, Barlow was in the next room, arguing with the clerk about a water rights claim. He heard Abernathy's raised voice and pushed his way in, curious. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes falling on the lustrous furs spread across the table. Then on Mary's calm, composed face. He saw the respect in the professional buyer's eyes. All the bluster and arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. He had laughed at her for buying firewood. She had unearthed a king's ransom. He turned without a word and left, his humiliation a silent, heavy thing. The town's perception shifted for good. The whispers were no longer of the fool girl, but of the quiet woman who had seen what no one else could see. People began to ride out to the fort, not to pry, but to offer help, to be part of the story. Mr. Abernathy made her a generous offer for the entire lot, a sum that would make her wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. But Mary looked at the papers he pushed toward her, and then she looked out the window, toward the mountains. She was thinking of a man named Jean Dubois and his daughter, Cécile. Mary sold only a small portion of the furs to Mr. Abernathy, enough to purchase proper tools, supplies, and a deed to the fort free and clear, with a tidy sum left over to see her through a dozen winters. The rest of the treasure remained in the cold, silent vault, a trust she was not yet ready to part with. She didn't want a mansion in Cheyenne or a life of ease. The work had become part of her. The fort had become part of her. With the money and the help of Jed and a few other hands drawn by the legend of her story, she began to restore the old trading post not as a monument, but as a living place. They rebuilt the collapsed palisade, re-roofed the main building, and turned the outbuildings into clean, simple cabins for travelers. She used a portion of the gold from the strongbox to establish a trust with the circuit judge, a fund dedicated to providing for orphaned children in the territory. She called it the Cécile Dubois Fund. The fort became what it was always meant to be, a beacon of shelter and commerce on the edge of the wilderness. Months later, the late afternoon sun of a new autumn cast a golden light over the valley. The fort was alive. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer, Thomas, the man she'd rescued, who had stayed on to help, rang from the smithy. A family whose wagon had broken an axle was resting in one of the guest cabins, their children chasing chickens in the yard. Mary stood leaning against a newly repaired section of the wall, looking out at the vast, peaceful landscape. Silas stood beside her, his soft muzzle resting on her shoulder in a familiar gesture of companionship. The harshness of the land was still there, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like home. Thomas walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. He gestured with his hammer at the bustling yard, at the solid, welcoming buildings. "You've done something here, Mary," he said, his voice full of quiet admiration. "More than just rebuild. What are you going to call this place now? Can't keep calling it Blackwood's Folly." Mary watched a hawk circle high on a thermal, its wings gilded by the setting sun. She thought of the deed that cost $10, the mockery, the cold, and the long-dead father's love she had found in the dark. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. "It's not about what you own," she said quietly. "It's about what you look after." Thank you for staying with us for Mary Coulter's incredible story. It's a powerful reminder of the enduring power of stewardship and how true value is often hidden right beneath our feet, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. If her journey moved you, please give this video a like and share in the comments what you think the most important inheritance a person can receive is. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of forgotten places and the remarkable people who bring them back to life.